Thank you. Today, we will be having a session on learning theories for inclusive teaching. This is our topic for today. And the presentation will be made by Dr. Maite E. Maebana, module code INC4802, module name Teaching Strategies for Inclusivity from the Department of Inclusive Education. And our presentation will be structured in the following way. We will be having the introduction, policies related to the implementation of inclusive education, learning theories for inclusive teaching, theory of inclusive special education, critical disability theory, human rights theory, inclusive pedagogy, the capability approach, social construction theory, indigenous knowledge system and African pedagogy, and conclusion. In the interest of time, we're finding out that this presentation will be made from learning unit number 1. And the following are our learning outcomes. When you have listened to this presentation, you should be able to critically evaluate a range of learning theories applicable to the implementation of inclusive teaching and learning. Describe how each theory will influence your teaching practice in your inclusive classroom. And lastly, you will be in a position to reflect on your own practice, theory of inclusive education. In the interest of time, let's just go straight to the introduction. Our introduction will be based on different definitions of inclusive education. We're finding out that it is advisable to note that there is no single universally accepted definition of inclusion. And this is attributed to the conceptual difficulties in defining the philosophy, including what counts to be as evidence of its practice and model practice. This has been obtained from Florian, 2012. Consider the following definitions of inclusion. Inclusion is about the community. In addition, we're saying inclusion is a dynamic process. And inclusive education refers to the restructuring of social and, by implication, educational settings in order to meet the needs of all learners, irrespective of their status of disability or any trajectories. As we continue with the definitions of inclusive education, we're saying inclusive education constitutes a radical paradigm shift and by no means should be considered as a linear progression from a special needs approach. This has been obtained from Liasido, 2015, page 5. And as we continue with the definitions of inclusive education, we're saying inclusive education is a policy priority as encapsulated in the international and Southern African legal frameworks, including the Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action on Special Needs from UNESCO 1994. White Paper 6 on Special Needs Education, Building and Inclusive Education and Training System of 2001. As a result, many learners with special needs or who experience barriers to learning are being enrolled. And the consolidated report on the implementation of inclusive education, however, revealed that many learners are still experiencing exclusion. That is from the Department of Basic Education 2015. In summary, we're saying inclusive education is about increasing the participation of learners in and reducing their exclusion from the cultures, curriculum, and communities of local schools. And inclusion is concerned with the learning and participation of all learners vulnerable to exclusionary pressures, not only those with disabilities or those categorized as experiencing learning barriers and development. It is concerned with improvement of staff as well as learners. In a nutshell, inclusion is about acknowledging that all learners have a right to education in their local community. Inclusion is concerned with fostering mutually sustaining relationships between schools and communities. We get into the policies related to the implementation of inclusive education. This module focuses mainly on South African policies related to the inclusive education. The first policy, that is the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of 2007, and the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of 2006, specifically Article number 24. And the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of 1989, especially Article 23, and Education White Paper 6 on Special Needs Education, Building an Inclusive Education and Training System of 2001. In addition, we have got the Policy on Screening, Identification, Assessment and Support, and the Constitution of South Africa, Act number 108 of 1996, the South African Schools Act number 84 of 1999, the Education White Paper 5 on Early Childhood Development of 2001, the Children's Act number 38 of 2005, the National Curriculum and Assessment Policy Statement, which begins from grade R to grade 12 of 2001, the HIV and AIDS in Education Policy of 1999, the Integrated School Health Policy of 2012, etc. And we have got the challenges of teachers. Teachers are confronted with many challenges in teaching and managing social and behavioral development while ensuring academic success for all learners. Recent research has found that learners with diverse needs are far more likely to be socially excluded at school compared to other peers, according to Lindsay et al. 2014. We acknowledge that inclusion of children with diverse learning needs is one of the most complex and poorly understood areas of education. Therefore, classroom teachers in particular face many challenges educating learners with disabilities alongside their typically developing peers. It is therefore important to understand the range of teaching strategies used to successfully include children with disabilities within mainstream classes. And this is the focus of this module. The learning theories for inclusive education. Learning theories are theoretical frameworks that underpin our daily inclusive practices as teachers. They are shaped by our ideas, attitudes, and beliefs concerning learning and teaching based on research, practice, and policy. There are several learning theories that underpin inclusive teaching. As a postgraduate student, you are strongly encouraged to explore other theories related to inclusive education. For the purpose of this presentation, we will focus on the following theories. The first theory, that is theory of inclusive special education. Hornby 2015 introduced a new theory for the education of learners with special needs and disabilities. This was prompted by his belief that inclusive education and special education are based on different philosophies that provide conflicting views and approaches on how best to educate the learners with special needs and disabilities. Consequently, the theory of inclusive special education attempts to synthesize the opposing philosophies, values, and practices of inclusive education by merging them with interventions, strategies, and procedures commonly applied to special education. In continuation, we say the theory of inclusive special education, therefore, aims to guide the development of policies, procedures, as well as teaching strategies that are appropriate for all learners with special needs and disabilities. For further readings, Hobby G 2015 Inclusive Special Education, Development of New Theory for Education of Children with Special Needs and Disabilities, published by the British Journal of Special Education. Then we get into the critical disability theory. Critical disability theory symbolizes a change from disability and disablement to ableism. In this way, the theory tries to empower the powerless and transform the prevailing social injustices and inequalities, as well as discrimination and social exclusion. We're saying critical disability theory is derived from the critical social theory first outlined by Max Horkheimer, which has today become a diverse family of critical theories which offer various approaches to social inquiry. A critical jurisprudence of disability identifies the sources of oppression within the law and legal institution, and by means of that exposure seeks to relieve disabled people from that oppression and identifies the potentiality or the potentially positive role of law and seeks to create law, use existing law, and list legal institutions in the struggle for the emancipation of disabled people, which is the rationale for CDT itself. And the human rights theory. Inclusion is regarded as a human right issue, since diversity is a norm as well as positive and enriching. All learners are viewed as equally valued members of society who are entitled to an education. Inclusive education is associated with equity and social justice and a human rights approach to social relations. In the classroom context, all learners enjoy acceptance, tolerance, respect, and the celebration of diversity. The Salamanca Statement of 1994 placed the obligation on the state to protect and enhance the rights of disabled learners. And the declaration proclaims the fundamental rights of every child to access education in mainstream inclusive schools. It clearly states that inclusion and participation are essential to human dignity and to the enjoyment and exercise of human rights. Segregation and discriminatory practices are regarded as a violation of human rights. Learners who experience barriers to learning or who are disabled should not be educated in special schools. And some proponents of this theory advocate for the abolition of special schools, and others believe that special schools have no place within the rights-based framework. Note that in the South African education system, there is no room for special schools as well as full service schools. The main aim of the human rights approach to education is to accommodate learners' diversity in the socially just and democratic ways. This necessitates celebrating differences, recognizing and accommodating individual needs, removing all forms of oppression, and further readings can be made from Pentic N and Florian L. 2015, titled Developing Teachers as Agents of Inclusion and Social Justice. That is from Education Inquiry. Then we get into another theory, that is the inclusive pedagogy. Classroom teachers are increasingly being confronted by learners with diverse needs. And inclusive education has resulted in learners with special needs being educated in mainstream settings. And teachers, therefore, need inclusive pedagogy or an inclusive pedagogical approach to make the best use of what they already know when learners experience difficulties. According to Florian and Linklater 2010, inclusive pedagogy focuses on the following: extending what is usually available as part of the classroom routine to respond to learners' diverse needs. Secondly, shifting teaching and learning from what works for most learners alongside something additional for some learners who experience difficulties. In addition, shifting the teacher's thinking from and some to everyone, and developing a greater awareness and understanding of the educational and social conditions that can influence children's learning. And lastly, equipping teachers with strategies to support learners and respond to their difficulties appropriately. And the capability approach. The four principles of the capability approach includes equal participation, which includes resources, agency, recognition, and practical reasoning. And according to inclusive pedagogy, schools need to be made or to make pedagogical, individual, and institutional arrangements that enable equal participation for all. Implications of the capability approach. Educational processes are employed for the purpose of expanding human capability, and the emphasis is placed on democratic values in a fair, well-functioning society, and all human beings are viewed as having the right of choice in determining their life trajectories. And all human beings should be provided with the tools that allow them to realize their potential. And democratic values are particularly important for the creation of context, and individuals should be willing and able to strive towards new possibilities. And praxis plays a central role in education. And lastly, evaluating human well-being, equality, freedom, and rights are central features. And social constructivist theory. The social constructivist theory is an extension of constructivism into social setting. Groups construct knowledge for one another collaboratively. In this way, they create a shared artifacts with shared meanings. When one is immersed within a culture in this way, one is learning all the time how to be part of the culture. We construct knowledge socially through interaction with one another. Who we are and what we know have been shaped by our experiences and interpretations. Developmental models, individual development in social context. This section delineates the theoretical framework and underlying models related to the development in general. Various theoretical frameworks have been articulated that emphasize the mutual reciprocity between the learner and the environment. Theories of human development, such as ecological theory or the socio-historical theory. In other words, what an individual perceives and learns is an integral part of the immediate context as well as related context. And indigenous knowledge systems and African pedagogy. Contemporary South African policies on the implementation of inclusive education emphasize a socio-ecological community-based collaborative approach to learning support. Moreover, contextual factors and influences are investigated and considered for learners who experience barriers to learning. Therefore, inclusive education is grounded in the bioecological system of Bronfenbrenner, which emphasizes that there is a complexity of influences, interactions, and interrelationships between the individual intervention. It is essential that a whole child approach to learning support be followed. And developing your practice theory. As a postgraduate student, you are encouraged to reflect on the range of theoretical perspective and consider which theory or theories you will apply to your daily teaching. Inclusive education is understood to refer to the placement of learners with special education needs in mainstream settings along with other learners without any form of disability. Therefore, inclusive education determines appropriate educational practices used in them general education schools by offering a variety of educational services to help learners with special needs to learn better according to their abilities and needs. Theoretical perspectives as the principal theories supporting inclusive education practices are the focus of this presentation. The focus is to emphasize the transition from theory to practice, which relates to the application of important aspects of learning theories to optimize instructional actions. Instructional strategies and techniques include modifications of curriculum and instructional design, the development structures, and the use of evidence-based practice. Therefore, three major theories underpin inclusive education practices. Effective inclusive education practice should incorporate ideas from each of these three theories so that teachers can successfully make curricular instructional decisions for each learner. Therefore, each of the theories underpinning inclusive education practice is theoretically and practically detailed hereunder. Starting with behaviorism-based inclusive education practice. Theoretically, behaviorism as one of the classical theories of learning and also recognized as oldest, according to Nalia and Idris 2014. Behaviorism is known as a predominant psychological model as suggested by the metaphor for learning as the acquisition of stimulus responses pairs. Behaviorism believes objective of the theory is to impart knowledge of reality to the learners. And behaviorism occurs when the consequences are associated with the stimulus or response that is followed by reinforcement to be maintained. Practically, behaviorism-based inclusive education practices include the application of the behaviorism in inclusive education settings, which appears in the emphasis of learner behavior and performance in manipulating stimulus materials. Examples included in the well-known instructional approaches such as explicit or direct instruction. And we get into the second one, that is the cognitive-based inclusive education practice. Theoretically, cognitivism is essentially focused on the attributes of one's thinking, memory, and motivation to learn. As Piaget argued that during its developmental stage, the ability to learn and process information is different. And the cognitive aspect focuses on the mental activities of the learner that influences responses. And cognitive theories placed emphasis on making knowledge meaningful and helping learners be organized. And therefore, cognitive instruction must be based on a learner's existing mental structures or schema. And practically, cognitive-based inclusive education practices involves the application of cognitivism in inclusive education setting, which clearly appears in the emphasis of mental information, processing, and interaction in guiding learners' learning. Learners are encouraged to express and connect their prior knowledge learning experiences and abilities to learn new information being provided to them. And cognitivism-based inclusive education are implemented by applying various instructional methods which are focused on learning activities such as note-taking. And cognitivism-based inclusive education practice. Theoretically, constructivism focuses on creating tools that reflect wisdom of the culture in which they are used, as well as the insights and experiences. And constructivism equates to learning that involves constructing, creating, and inventing, basically for individuals to develop their own knowledge and meaning. And constructivists believe that an understanding of the brain informs teaching, and teachers are essentially considered to be facilitators, providing essential information and organizing activities for learners to discover their own learning. And practically, constructivism-based inclusive practice are the application of constructivism in inclusive education settings, which would involve instructional methods and strategies to assist learners explore complex topics. And according to Halgin and Drake 2011, inclusive education requires a constructivist approach to teaching and learning. And in conclusion, we say in this learning unit, we focused on several theoretical frameworks related to inclusive education. We examined the key principles of each theory and how it could be translated into practice in inclusive settings. And we also introduced you to the concept of a practice theory to stimulate your thinking about this theory or about how this theory could be implemented in practice. And this marks the end of our presentation for today, and thank you for your time. Ntate Madiope? Ntate Madiope? I'm done with my lesson presentation.
Okay, I think because in